All right. So yeah, lovely to see you all. Welcome to Lecture 5 of Philosophy of Language, where we're going to use that word so damn many times today that we're going to hit semantic saturation. That's where you say a word so many times it just starts to sound like just sounds. There's no meaning. I'm going to say the word language a lot. And the
May I
plan.
ask a practical question? Are we supposed to be able to download the recommended reading?
Yeah, did it not work?
It didn't for me, but I was supposed to log in via the institute, but...
Yeah, no, Tilburg University was not listed but one of the institutions through which you can log in to get the paper.
Weird. Okay, well, that's okay. I will put another PDF of it.
Well, I found it somewhere else, but I think it's the same. It was the same piece, but
Andrew Bailey, probably, his website.
I guess so. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Some illegal copy on it.
No, it's unclear. Yeah, but I'll put another link to things. Yeah, sorry. Okay, that is totally okay. With regards to the structure for today, I kind of figured it might be. So it might just be best if we just push through and aim to end when we end, because I'm not sure that this will necessarily take up the full time. So I think it's probably easier than us going and then taking a break and then kind of like having 20 minutes afterwards or something like that. Is that okay with everybody?
We did just have 2 hours of lecture without a break already.
Okay.
And also, perhaps some people like me would like to eat something.
That's no problem. I think honestly,
Scale issue.
we've probably got about an hour of material to cover. So yeah, that's sort of what I mean. It will depend on how many questions and things we do. But I want to make sure that, so I'll operate on the idea that people haven't got a chance to read the paper. But even still, I don't think we're going to have the full hour and a half of material to cover. So don't stress. What I want to talk about today is a paper. Actually, I really love this paper by one of my absolute favorite philosophers, David Lewis, who looks like what you would expect a philosopher to look like. Yes.
Yeah, I got an immediate question about this one because the previous lecture you said everyone that we teach about is an asshole, but he doesn't seem like that.
He is not. He is not.
So
He is actually genuinely just a lovely human being. He was very clearly somewhere on the spectrum, and the things that he would talk about was beer, trains, possible worlds, and how lovely his wife was. And basically, he would just sit there and be stone silent otherwise. But if those topics came up, he would come to life and talk. And he was one of the very few people who called out some of the other assholes that we talked about. So Kripke, if you guys remember from lecture 2, basically Lewis got Kripke fired from a job because Kripke was a serial sexual harasser. And Lewis said, look, either he goes or I go. And they fired Kripke and kept Lewis, which was a very wise move. So yes, he's a lovely human being. But yeah, so I want to talk to you today about his paper, Languages and Language. And the idea is to kind of bring together the two strands that are lurking behind the stuff we've looked at. So that's what we're going to start off with, is two conceptions of what language is. And then we'll have a kind of interlude where we talk about conventions. And then once we have a conception of conventions in mind, we can move on to reconcile these two different conceptions of language. We'll show that actually they fit together quite nicely, given a certain kind of series of assumptions. And that will then set us up to be able to kind of build on what we've covered in both strands. So the stuff about semantics in the first few lectures, and the stuff about pragmatics broadly that we've talked about in the last 2 lectures. So that's the kind of hope, to take those two things and put them together to have a complete conception of what language is and how it functions. To start with, we'll talk a little bit about bilingualism in a kind of jokey way. Right? So first, we'll have a conception of language that we can think of as the formal conception. The formal conception of language is a function. It's a mapping. And it's a mapping of strings of marks or sounds to meanings. So you have a function that gives you an ordered pair. There's some, in this case, light being beamed onto the wall, and that light being beamed onto the wall is mapped to whatever the hell we think meanings are. Could be Phrygian senses, could be propositions, whatever we want it to be. Importantly here, you're going to have finite sequences of sounds or marks. And then we could say that, hey, our pound sign, let's call it L, is a language. At is some sentence. And then L of at is going to be the meaning of at in L. Again, nothing really wild here. This is just a semi-formalized way to say, right, there's going to be sentences, and those sentences are mapped to meanings. And then with that ordered pair, we'll have another function that takes that ordered pair and the world and maps it up to a truth value. So Nathan's shirt is green. That sequence of sounds, together with some meaning, that bundle, together with the fact that my shirt is in fact green, gets us to truth. So meanings plus the world gives us truth values. Meaning is then going to be some kind of function, and it can be a function from possible worlds to truth values if you want. We don't have to have that bit. This is just a fancy way of saying, right, the purpose of language is to get us to truth values. This is the conception of language that underpins something like TFL, that underpins something like first-order logic, that underpins the kinds of questions Frege and Russell and Kripke were after. And the idea here is something like what we might call language realism. Language truthfully depicts the world, or it's trying to. So this is our formal conception. The second conception of language we can call a social conception. Here, language is a social activity. It's stuff that we're doing when we engage with each other. To quote Lewis, it's a social phenomenon, part of the natural history of human beings, sphere of human action, wherein people utter strings of vocal sounds or inscribe strings of marks, wherein people respond by thought or action to the sounds or marks which they observe to have been produced. It's really just a way for us to interact. Importantly, it's used between rational people, or trying to be rational people, to communicate their beliefs and desires, and to achieve intended goals. And we can see this, right? You literally have this sort of Gricean concept. Remember the reflexive intentions that Grice wanted to have? So there's something like this underpinning this social conception. It's going to be generated by humans' beliefs and desires. We're going to wish to achieve some goal, and the uttering of the language, the use of the language, is just a way to get that goal. Importantly, on this conception, it's a form of rational convention-governed social activity. Why is it convention-governed? Well, I mean, it's not like it just kind of came into being naturally. Language didn't develop like a tree. We sort of hammered it out as we move along. And what's really important here is that these rules and conventions are going to be established basically on us kind of trying to get around in the world and trying to get along with each other. Importantly here, it's not about truth. It's about interacting. It's about utility. So we get this idea, right? There's regularities in actions, these sort of past conformities, engender future conformities. It keeps perpetuating itself. Language, importantly on this conception, has very little to do with truth or correspondence to the world. It's just about, helping us get along.
With the world
Is there any distinction made between our experience world and the world bit? No.
In some sense, we don't really need to care about that, right? When we're just thinking here, it's a question of, is the purpose of language truth, which is a sort of formal conception, correspondent to world, whether it's perceived world or deep, dark world out there, versus is it just something for us to kind of coordinate our actions? So, yeah, the concept of world here is very neutral, if you like.
Sort of folk psychology-ish kind of thing.
It doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be. Again, what's really important is this idea that on the social conception, language is just another way to act. It's not something that's truth tracking or corresponding to the world in any way, shape, or form. It's just yet another way for us to kind of bump into each other and move around. If you like, on the social conception, the purpose of language is kind of manipulation. I have beliefs, desires, ends that I want to achieve, and when I'm making these sounds, what I'm really trying to do is to get you to believe something or to behave the way that I want you to, or whatever. So there's no kind of corresponding to the world that we care about. Truth is redundant, unhelpful. It's not the goal. Whereas on the formal conception, that is the ends. That is what we're trying to get to. So this difference, again, we can call them language realism and language anti-realism, but that's the big, deep, dark split here. Right? Is language just a tool that we're using to kind of get around in the world, or is it really about truthfully depicting the world in some way, or representing the world in some way? Yeah.
So formal language doesn't have to be true, right? It just has. So you mean with language realism just that it could come?
Yeah.
Point out a specific.
Again, the aim is to try and track the truth. It could be wrong, right? And that's totally fine. That would just be, right, it's not quite doing the job that we wanted it to, but that would be the aim.
So the job we wanted to do is to be true. We don't just want to make accurate statements that might be true.
That's the kind of real aim, right? Again, we can play around with that, right? It could just be, hey, this is the best we're going to get, as accurate as we can. Right? That would be fine as well. That's in this spirit. So again, what's the idea here on the formal conception? Semantics is what matters. Semantics is what matters in the sense that it's the truth values of the expressions that are key. We're trying to figure out truth conditions. That's what language is about. This is the kind of thing you'll get if you do a semantics class or if you're interested in linguistics. Most linguistics, not all, but most. This is the kind of conception, though. The social one is one where you'll get in maybe an anthropology class or human geography, or if we're thinking in most social sciences, the kind of thing we might approach language as. We don't really care about representing the world. It's more about coordination, right? Manipulation, not necessarily in a bad way. Interaction. Speech acts fit this conception, right? Because what we're interested in isn't the truth value of the assertions or the truth value of the sentences. We're interested in what are they doing with these assertions. Grice's theory can be seen as this, right? What's really the point of language is to get the receiver to believe something, to do something, to act. We don't really care about whether the thing that they're supposed to believe is true or false or whatever. Okay.
With like Nietzsche's pragmatism?
Kinda.
Because he also critiques like the correspondence with the reality, right?
Yeah. Though that's coming in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
But importantly, right, we've got these two conceptions. So social conception, formal conception. They look at loggerheads. They look irreconcilable because one of them says the function of language is truth, representation, as accurate as we can, if that's the best we can do, but truth. The other one says engagement, coordination, cooperation. So, can these two conceptions be reconciled? That's the big challenge. And that's what Lewis's paper is about. It's going to try and find a way to make these two conceptions fit together. In terms of what we've talked about, can the kind of projects that we were looking at in weeks 1 and 2 fit up with the projects we were looking at in lectures 3 and 4? How do they fit together? Segue. Let's talk about conventions. I mentioned them already, but conventions are going to play a key role in the reconciliation. So to get a run at conventions, let's play a game. Oh shit, that sounded very like Saw. Like, let's play a game. So, are you guys familiar with like Prisoner's Dilemma kind of games? Yeah. These sorts of things? Yeah, okay, cool. Right? So, you got A and B. This is a much easier one. Right? A and B want to go to the movies. They're broadly indifferent about whether they go see some Marvel slop or they go see an art house foreign film, some proper cinema. Right? But importantly, they want to go together. That's the big thing. Because they don't really care about the movie. They care about the chat afterwards, where they pick the movie apart. So you have a kind of coordination. They can either both go see the Marvel slop, they can both go see the cinema, but if they screw up and kind of miss a line, nobody's happy. So what you have are strategies that they can enact, right? Okay, I'm going to go to the Marvel movie and I hope that he goes too. Something like this, right? This is silly because, of course, they would be WhatsApping each other, whatever. And you have incompatible strategies. We have incompatible strategies that fulfill their preferences equally well, right? Both to the Marvel movie, both to the cinema. But they need to coordinate, because if they don't coordinate, then nobody's happy. So this is a coordination problem. Shockingly named. So how do we solve the coordination problem? Well, conventions are a way to resolve a certain kind of coordination problem. Because this could be a one-off, right? Or it could be a repeating coordination problem. So instead of just one time, these two guys keep talking and they want to keep going to the movies every week. So they could come up with a convention. All right, we'll go see the Marvel movie this week, and then next week we'll go watch the 8-hour-long Holocaust film, right? Really going to have a good Friday night. And they switch back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So they set up this convention to resolve this coordination problem that's iterative. And you see this all the time, right? Coordination problems can be one-off. If you're walking down a narrow hallway with someone coming the other way, how do you move so you get around? Or there's going up and down the stairs in the underground, right? Stand on the right, walk on the left. So again, we can have recurrent, we can have one-offs, coordination games. And how one approaches coordination games or coordination problems will differ for recurrent ones. Here's another one. You guys might have even seen this one before, right? So you've got 3 players, right? And each player has 3 options, A, B, or C. If all players play A, then player 1 gets $20 and everyone else gets 19. If they all play B, player 2 gets $20 and everyone else gets 19. And if they all play C, player 3 gets $20 and everybody else gets 19. Importantly, if they don't perfectly line up, nobody gets nothing. So what do? Well, probably what you're going to do is sit there with all 3 of you, especially if this keeps going. You'll be like, look, we'll all play A for the first one, and then we'll play B, and then we'll play C, and we'll just keep going like this, right? And, you might have somebody who doesn't want to play. Then we're off into joyful prisoner's dilemma territory. But again, hopefully this is sort of familiar stuff. Importantly, if it was a one-off, you might just sit there and be like, no, we're all playing C, dude. I'm not playing unless we play C. Different strategies for different versions of the problem. Conventions are solutions to recurring coordination problems. We have an example with driving on the left, right? Or driving on the right. There's no particular reason to prefer driving on the left-hand side of the road to driving on the right-hand side of the road. Both do equally well. But we all have a strong reason to converge. We better adopt the same course of behavior as the other people on the road, or we're about to have a bad time. Does anybody know what this photo is of? This is amazing. This was one of the world's biggest coordination problems. No. So this is Sweden. This is actually Uppsala. This is the day where they switched which side of the road they drive on. So I think it's May 7th of like the 60s, 1968, 67, where they switched from left-hand to right-hand driving.
So because they would also have to change all their roads, right? Or at least their highway infrastructure. Because there you can't just arbitrarily, you can't just switch. You have to build out the whole lot of asphalt.
They got to build new off-roads and on-ramps and off-ramps.
I don't think Sweden had highways in
Well, perhaps that might be.
It's a good question. It's often called one of the largest infrastructure activities ever undertaken because they all had to change at the same time. Yeah.
Why was
That is beyond my pay grade. But importantly, it is a really lovely instance of this kind of resolution of a coordination problem. They made an explicit choice, and they told everybody, hey, you got to drive on the right-hand side now. If you do it on the left, you are not going to obey the law. We're going to arrest you or take your license away or whatever you like.
all these thousands of people?
Yes, who are very confused. But it's a great like visual case of where there's this coordination problem, and in this case, the Swedish government stepped in and explicitly stipulated a coordination move, right? They set out the convention. The convention is going to be that side, drive on that side, rather than that side. I mean, the thing that would be really annoying is if you had a left-hand drive car, and then suddenly you have to drive on the other side. I don't know if you've ever done that, but it's awful. Because you're sitting like all the way against the edge of the road, and the body of your car is that way. So it's very hard to tell like if you're close to the midline or not. Yeah.
Do they have this with the channel tunnel, some very complicated system to switch the people driving into the UK and out of the UK to switch the side of the lane they're on?
So what you do is you actually have to get on a train. You don't drive through it.
You can't drive it. Then it was perhaps something in the Middle East or something. Because
they
they
parked your car on a train.
I believe there is
Anyway.
some border where they have.
This is we're getting off topic. So, slightly expanding it out, we can say, right, a convention, we'll say a regularity R is a convention in a population, if and only if, within the population, something like these 6 conditions hold. So, and it's qualifications in a population because we want to allow for, sub-populations of a big group that obey a convention. We want to allow for things like slang to develop amongst groups. So we'll have everyone conforms to the regularity. Everyone believes that the others in the population conform to the regularity. This belief gives everyone a good reason to conform to the regularity. Those first 3 should sound familiar, right? Because those 3, what do those look like? That's grace. That's the reflexive intentions all over again. Intends, believes that the others intends, and that belief is supposed to be at least partially causal. So everybody conforms, everybody believes the others in the population conform. That belief gives you a good reason to conform. There's a general preference for general conformity rather than a slightly less than general conformity. So it's something like a resolution to the coordination problem. Importantly, this regularity isn't the only option. There are other ways to go. and all of the above is known to the population. And note, right, we have to put some asterisks on the everyone because we can allow for almost everyone. We can allow for outliers. And again, when we think of mutual knowledge here, we can allow for some outliers here as well. It has to be at least tacit mutual knowledge. So again, what is this really saying? Basically, it's going to count as a regularity, is going to count as a convention if pretty much everybody does it, pretty much everybody knows everybody does it. Right? It resolves our coordination problem in a reasonably successful way. There are other ways we could have gone, but we didn't for whatever reason, and we all know that stuff. So, driving on the right would be a convention in this case, because everybody pretty much conforms to it. Everybody believes everyone's going to conform to it. It's not the only option. We could have driven on the left. Everybody knows the rules, or at least everyone who's relevant should know the rules. Except. Another really simple one, right? Why do we nod for saying yes and shake our head for saying no? Well, it's a convention. Gives some points. Right? We understand what this means, right? We believe that this is what the other person is conveying when they perform this action. We could very easily perform other actions instead. It's just the one that we've sort of settled on. Yes?
So we've got this little play of words in our friend group. It's in Dutch. It's quite, we use it a lot. It's when you say something like, this is right, isn't it?
Do I need to stop the recording?
No. I'm going all formal. So this is right, isn't it? And you pose a negation. So if it indeed isn't right, you have to say yes. But everyone intuitively says no.
Yeah. So this would count as a convention, right? Within that population of people, there you go. Right? In that case, what you're doing, you could either think about it in terms of it's a convention to frame questions in this kind of way, to trap people with the answer, or it's a convention to expect these sorts of trap questions.
Well, yeah, but how do I explain it correctly? It is the convention that saying the opposite, like having a double negation, that's the social convention. Yeah. So everybody does that. So we just say yes. So when you have to say no because you have a double negation. Yeah. But in that sense, you, how do you say it? You actually, logically, give the right answer, but it still confuses people.
Well, I think that's again, it's going to tick all of these boxes, right? Another really good one is Australians do this thing where they say yeah, nah. Or no, yeah, right? Yeah. What they mean is no for the first one and yes for the second one, right? But it's again the same kind of thing. Another very silly one. So there's a question lurking here about how small the population can be. But Amanda and I, when we were first learning Dutch, we got really we were entertained by saying ja hoor to each other. So that would just be what we would say all the time to anything. And that's an interesting one. It's not clear if that counts as a convention because, well, why would that not count as a convention? Why is that arguably not going to count as a convention on this account? Well, so that should still be okay. It's a population.
It doesn't give you a good reason to conform to it?
Yeah, there's basically no coordination problem in solving, right? It doesn't do anything. It's just sort of noise we're making, right? So there's no coordination problem in solving. Basically this, right? Yeah.
And political systems?
So political systems, the settling upon them could be counted as a kind of convention, right? You might think one of the reasons that the US is in the state that it is so much of political behavior was actually convention rather than stipulated by law. And this is why you've got to have that first couple things, right? Everybody's got to behave according to a certain way. If somebody doesn't, it's really hard to know what to do.
to some extent, you need to assume that there is mutual knowledge, right? Because, or else you'd be stuck with like some ideal, yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah. There needs to be some kind of agreed upon,
Yeah, right.
like, okay, we're going to do it this way. So there's an interesting question about how these get going. But the nice thing is, there's plenty of flexibility here. This is an account of what happens once it started going. There's two questions. Yeah, start here and then go back. Yeah.
Yeah, it was not a question just to me, Mark. It's interesting if you read this, why there is so much change, for example, in language.
Yes.
Because it doesn't seem to make sense because you're changing conventions, right? So why would you do that?
Good. So here's the nice thing. There is room for change of conventions over time. Where's the room for that change going to come in? If we're looking at this account of what a convention is.
The asterisk?
Well, not quite. It's going to be this fourth clause, right? If it turns out that there's an even better solution to the coordination problem, what we really should do is start to adopt that convention instead. So
But then you're assuming that the change is for the better,
Yeah.
which is
For
in many
social-
cases obviously not true.
that's totally true, right? But again, it could be a case where, for other reasons, we start to think that this is a better solution in some kind of sense, right? It might not be a good solution for this coordination problem, but when we think about that coordination problem in conjunction with larger situations, a bigger one that it is a part of, this could be a better solution. Oh, sorry, there was well, all the way back, and then we'll come back to you. Yeah.
So, for instance, the fourth clause would also help with settling for just like, hey, interacting with this convention in good faith is also therefore preferred. That's why the system doesn't break down.
Yeah. It always has to be done in good faith.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, because otherwise you get lying, and lying breaks down all communication.
That is the kind of idea, right? So that's going to be one thing that you have to have. Everyone needs to be kind of acting in good faith. If someone's abusing the system, abusing the convention, it's not necessarily going to have a setup to deal with that. Yes, sorry.
Also, you see, for very important systems, the language doesn't really change at all. If you look at how our laws are written, I mean, there's very little change in language. So it's only for when it's unimportant and there's some subcultural reason. When you're talking about Fortnite, you can adopt all kind of new words. But when it gets important, and also the people who talk that way about Fortnite don't talk that way in their business units, because then they think, well, actually this convention is quite useful.
You can also think about them as different contexts, right? So you could have the same population in different contexts have different conventions. That's totally feasible, right? You could whether you want to call them a particular population or think of them as a different population. So there's this person in this context versus that same person in a different context, 6 in one, half a dozen in the other. That would be totally fine. So then there could be a discussion about, in the overall context or the general mode of speaking, what kind of convention do they have? And it might be such that there isn't going to be a general convention because there's so many sub populations or sub contexts. Does that make sense? Did everybody kind of follow that? That was very sloppily presented. So if you're thinking about it this way, right, is there global conventions if we take the population to be everyone on Earth, right? Well, really hard to see if there is, right? Because it's not really necessarily going to be such that everyone conforms to some convention, right? There's going to be enough groups of people who behave in different kinds of ways that it's not going to kind of get everyone. What's important here is that, again, when we get these conventions, they can be agreed upon either explicitly or tacitly. The Sweden picture from a few minutes ago, that was an explicit one. The government said, hey, from now on, everybody's got to drive on the right. And so then it was enforcing a convention explicitly or stipulating a convention to then be adopted. But of course, you might have it generated tacitly. Why do we nod rather than shake our head? Very unlikely somebody explicitly said, hey, this is how we're going to say yes from now on, right? It just sort of developed. Yeah, exactly. It's like, great, we'll add that in.
It's also when you have a norm and you break the norm that you get corrected. Is also pleasant because there are many norms now that we haven't discussed. But if I break them, I will hear that I have break them. But we haven't necessarily explicitly agreed on them.
Yeah. So it's a way to kind of build the consensus, if you like.
Yeah.
Note that there's nothing in this account of how that building process goes.
Okay.
This is just saying, right, this is what a convention is. It looks like this.
Yeah.
Right? That's all it's trying to say.
Okay.
And there'll be plenty of things that are regularities that won't be conventions. Right? So here's an easy one. Causation is going to be a regularity that's not a convention. Because it doesn't satisfy this sort of not the only possible way to go. Breathing isn't a convention. Because, it's pretty hard to keep going if you stop doing that. You get the idea. It's an interesting thing. We'll come back to this in a minute, right? About the alternatives. So, this is this sort of segue on conventions. And I should point out, this is Lewis's account of conventions. He rehashes it in his paper, but he originally develops it in his PhD thesis about conventions as the foundations for language. Which I'm spoiling what the next step is, right? Because remember, the problem that we left section 1 with was how do we make the formal and social conceptions of language play nice with each other? Well, the reason we just talked for 20 minutes or 30 minutes about conventions is that's going to do the job. So how does that go? Well, first, another nice quote from Lewis, right? It's a platitude, something only a philosopher would dream of denying, that there are conventions of language, although we do not find it easy to say what those conventions are. If we look for the fundamental difference in verbal behavior between members of two linguistic communities, we can be sure of finding something which is arbitrary, but perpetuates itself because of a common interest in coordination. In the case of conventions of language, a common interest derives from our common interest in taking advantage of and in preserving our ability to control others' beliefs and actions to some extent by means of sounds and marks. That interest in turn derives from many miscellaneous desires we have to list the ways you'd be worse off in Babel. Love that little phrase at the end, right? So, what's the idea here? Basically, there are going to be conventions when it comes to language, and these conventions are ones that we're going to want to adopt because of the social conception of language. We want to get around in the world well. We have to resolve that getting around in the world well with each other coordination problem. Enter these conventions. Conventions will guide how we use language because it will help us resolve these coordination problems. But how does this bring us back to the formal convention? Well, the important thing is that we have a convention about how we use language. Speakers use a language L if and only if, according to Lewis, there is a convention of truthfulness and trust in the language. So it's truthfulness of the language and trust in the language. So what do we mean by that? To be truthful in L is to try to avoid uttering any sentence of L unless one believes it to be true. Similarly, to be trusting is to form beliefs in a certain way, to impute truthfulness in L to others, and to tend to respond to another utterance of any sentence of L by coming to believe the uttered sentence. So, what's being packed in here? This is, again, the sort of Grice stuff we talked about last week. The maxims of conversation. Right? Remember the maxims of quantity and quality. In this case, it's quality. If you're expressing something In English, say, we have a convention that we use expressions of English to convey things that we believe, that we take to be true. Shit, there's our formal conception back. Truth matters. Truth matters not because it's intrinsic to language, but because we operate with a convention of using language in a truthful way. So there's a general preference, according to Lewis, for general conformity to the regularity of truthfulness and trust in L, because we want to be able to get around with each other very well. Given that most conform to this convention, we should too. Again, what's he kind of trying to suggest here? We go back. He's saying that if we think about language, using language truthfully is a convention. Being trustworthy with a given language is a convention. And it's a convention because it ticks every one of these points. Everyone broadly conforms to it. There'll be cases where they don't, but things can break down, right? People can drive on the left, even if they're supposed to drive on the right. People can use language in an untruthful way, and things might go a little haywire, but most uses are going to be in this truthful and trustworthy way. Everybody knows that. Everybody, because they know that, that's one of the reasons why they do it. That gives us the general preference for behaving in this way. Here's the fun thing. Is it the only possible regularity here? Is being truthful in a given language the only possibility?
You could also all decide that you just speak in falsehoods and you would have the same result, right?
You could try that, yeah. I mean, basically just kind of carving out the truth in a very negative space. Yeah. We could also just speak a different language. That also counts because each given language will have a convention of being truthful in that language. This is why truthfulness and trust in L. Don't trust me if I try and speak Dutch. I'm not really trying to express things. I'm just trying to get my pronunciation right. I'm learning the language. Again, but I could get to a point where I'm part of the community, I would then have to satisfy the conventions. So that's another way we can go. Right? You can come at it at the very deep level of like, I'm not even going to bother tracking truth at all, or we could just use a different language to track the truth. So nice. So according to Lewis, there's going to be coordination because between truthful speakers and trusting hearers. Makes sense. Each is going to conform to these prevailing regularities of truthfulness and trust in the language because they expect complementary conformity from the other party. Again, this was grace, but now it's grace in service of the formal conception. Because Grice's story only works if there is this underpinning coordination to use the language truthfully. Again, it doesn't have to be every time, but most of the time. Note, though, that it is not a convention about being truthful and trusting others. It is about the language. It isn't a convention that we speak truly. We can lie, we can be wrong. It is definitive of the convention, though, that this convention creates reasons for trusting what the language says. The language is trying to express truth. Speakers might get stuff wrong. So that's the important thing, right? We trust that the language is expressing truths. Enter the semantics. Not that the speakers are necessarily, because they could just be wrong. It's fine. So do we see how these are fitting the two together? It isn't that language inherently is about truth. It's that we have a convention, according to Lewis, to use language in a truthful and trustworthy way.
I'm not sure if it brings everything together.
Tell me more.
It only seems a very small part of the total set of conventions,
It is.
right?
It
So,
is.
I mean, every word in language is a convention. The meaning of the word,
Good.
because it could be very different.
So here's something really interesting. What's the level of unit here? Is it words?
The level
Of convention, right? If we're thinking about what Lewis is kind of identifying, what's the level? Is it subsentential or is it going to be sentences? Because it looks an awful lot like if we buy this, it's going to have to just be at the level of sentences, not words. Because words aren't the sorts of things that we use truthfully and trustworthily. They are constituent parts of sentences, which are the sorts of things that we could trust. So your concern here, I think there's a couple ways to kind of think about the concern. One of them is, if we're thinking about individual words, it's not really clear how this story gets all the way down to individual words. It will stop at the level of sentences, because those are the kinds of things that actually express stuff that could be true or false.
Yeah, but there is also the convention of using words to indicate a certain thing
Yes.
or a certain concept, right?
So what we
if you lose that concept, you can't use words anymore.
So what Lewis is going to have to say is that those kinds of cases are compressed versions of expressing complete sentences. So when we use just a single word, we're actually expressing something that is at a sentential level rather than just at a word level. Which makes sense, right? You could say I do and you're saying something more, and you could say yes, etc., etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah, but in this sense, of course, a sentence could just be
It could be one word.
words or anything. The sentence is just anything that expresses, because you also have sentences that make a whole lot of claims. That's the entire, if you have the sentence that's this small and then it gets this big in MOL, that's because you claim a whole lot of things.
Because it's, yeah. But we couldn't say something like VF, right? That's not going to be at the level of analysis here, right? That F is too short, as it were. You need to have a verb, right? The F is a G. Okay, cool. Now we have a full sentence that could be true or false. Before, at least in English, it's not the kind of thing that can be true or false yet, right? The desk. Okay, cool. The desk what? Like, there's no verb yet. Right? So there isn't a sentence, so there isn't anything that could be true or false. That's the kind of thing that I was after. But I think your larger concern, if I remember it rightly, is that there's going to be a whole lot of other conventions that are at play here. Not just about the trustworthiness in L and the truthfulness in L. And that's totally true. But remember, his aim isn't to try and his aim is to try and show that the formal conception and the social conception can fit together. They're not inherently contradictory. And the way we can do that is by saying that there is this convention. There can be other ones too. Here's another example, right? We have a convention of driving on the right, but what's the convention when, an ambulance is coming down the road? So in some places, in the US, you just stop. You don't go anywhere. In the UK, you're supposed to pull over to the side of the road, whichever side is closer. So you can sometimes end up on the right-hand side in the UK, even though you're supposed to be driving on the left. So there could be conventions that override instances at the lower level. There's no problem with having that here too. There might be instances where it's beneficial to not be trustworthy or truthful. Does that make sense? Do we see the kind of idea there? Yeah. The examples are just kind of ways to get us to the thought. Okay. Was there another hand, or did I? Oh, okay. So again, what's Lewis trying to do? To give this marriage between the formal conception, the language realism, that language is about truth, and the social conception, that language is about getting around in the world, to show that actually, to get around in the world successfully, you're going to have something like this formal conception underpinning it. Though it's not inherent, it is a convention. And this comes back to something that you mentioned earlier. I forget who it was exactly. Talking about meaning change over time. There will have to be some kind of coordination between past speakers and present hearers, and vice versa. We'll need some kind of convention to help us understand what people in the past were saying. It's a little bit harder to think about how the past hearers will understand our language, but you could think of a few cases where that's going to work as well. So there isn't just a convention that applies at a time, it will apply across times as well. And it can be such that in order to understand what was being said in the past, we'll have to reinterpret. That's okay. Again. And there's a fun question here of how to make sense of change over time, which spoiled already. We can think of them as trying to resolve coordination problems better. We can think of them as trying to resolve larger coordination problems that have this particular language one embedded inside. Or you might just think that what's happening, to go back a few slides, is that something like this or this has broken down. Maybe not everybody's conforming anymore, or maybe people don't know that they're supposed to conform, for whatever reason. In which case, you couldn't keep this convention going, because not enough people are doing it. So you'd have to come up with a new one. That could also explain some meaning change. Okay. Nice. So, a couple fun questions. Okay. First, what happens when half the population routinely lies or exaggerates, uses sort of hidden meanings or something like that? How is this account going to make sense of those? What do we think?
Maybe it's just like sarcasm, but people adapt to it as well.
So that could be one way, right? We change so that the whole population could start to refine or modify how they think about things, what their modes of communication are, what their conventions are. That's one way that can go.
We have a lot of separate sets of conventions. So when someone exaggerates quite clearly, we have the convention that we then shrink down their exaggeration to a normal level. And when we think somebody has a good reason to lie, we have a set of conventions where we don't try to take true value from what they're saying, but from whatever else kind of information we have. There's such things.
That would be another one, right? I think this is, again, right, there might be something like meta-conventions that would account for some of these cases. Another thing that could happen is just population drift. You could have one group that behaves according to the truthfulness convention and one group that simply doesn't. And then you'll have a problem about those two groups communicating.
This touches upon sociological and anthropological things, right? Because people will do that because of identity, of group identity. And that's probably also the main reason that language changes, that young people tend to want to be different from the older ones, so they adopt new conventions. And it's probably the same with subgroups in...
So this is, there's plenty of space to allow for that kind of thing to happen on this account. But note what's really striking here is what happens when it's distinctly about the being truthful and trustworthy in the language. It's not necessarily just about using different expressions or different conventions in that way. What happens when people start attacking or undermining the convention of truthfulness in L? That's the worry. Yeah.
Communication breaks down.
Absolutely. Right. It's like Led Zeppelin all over the place, right? There's just no communication whatsoever. Because the whole thing that's driving it, the truthfulness and trustworthiness.
But at the same time, like Ren says, that people start to correct for it, right?
That would be the hope.
So if you read current newspapers and compare them with 30 years ago, there's a lot more extreme words, exaggerations, etc. But the meanings tend to be stringed down. So meaning changes, I think.
Yeah.
To adapt for this.
And again, what we're kind of seeing is effectively attempts to drag that convention of trustworthiness in L through these cases where people are violating it. But of course, if it gets to where everyone, or damn near everyone, or more than half, are violating that convention all the way through, it's really unclear what you can even do anymore.
Unless they're doing it in the same way all the time.
All the time, right? Because then what it's doing is actually continuing on that original convention. They've just now got a new way to express the truthfulness. That would be another thing, right? So if there's a convention that can be mapped back down to the truthfulness and trustworthiness, in effect, all they're doing is just simply inventing a kind of variation of the language.
In the sense that when the poles switch, we don't really have a problem because we just have to put our consciousness to the sound.
To the sound, right? As long as you're not, sailing at the moment, you'll be okay. And another kind of one, this comes back to what we were discussing earlier, right? What happens if we're just wrong, right? If our beliefs are wrong?
It shouldn't matter, right? Because it's a convention and we use it because it's,
We're doing the best we can, right? Even if it turns out that we're wrong about pretty much everything, the aim is still for truthfulness and trustworthiness in the language. And, right, okay, cool. We did the best we could.
Yeah, but the correspondence with the world will hit you, of course.
That's
If you're in an aeroplane and you believe that it remains flying without wings or something, then you will find out the hard way that there is something like correspondence with reality.
absolutely.
Or if you don't believe in gravity or
Yeah.
things like that.
But no, again, right? There might be ways that the world could let us know that we're getting it
Yeah,
wrong.
exactly.
But there might be plenty of ways where it's just simply the stuff that we're wrong about couldn't do that for whatever reason. But in that case, it's not going to impact the conventions for what we're using the language for. It just means that, well, we tried, we aimed for accuracy, but just weren't very good.
same as Phlogiston, for example, right?
Yeah, like the phlogiston stuff, right? We have a sense of what the dude was after there, just nothing that picks out. There is an interesting objection here, though. And to give you the objection, it's kind of weird, but it's worth thinking about. So this is an objection from Jonathan Hawthorne. Right? He says, okay, let's define a sub-part of English. So English, right, it's a weird language. English allows for really, 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 really long sentences. Or if you don't like to think about English, think about your favorite German philosopher, right? Who probably writes in extremely long sentences. Paragraphs and paragraphs, pages and pages is one sentence, right? So let's stick to English. We'll call Longlish that part of English consisting of sentences that are so long they can't actually be uttered. They're infinitely long, effectively. So you would die before you finish trying to utter them, right? Here's something weird, according to Hawthorne. We have truthfulness and trust in Longlish, vacuously. Why is that? Well, you can't utter a Longlish sentence falsely, because you can't utter it. So you must be truthful in that language. Whatever you say in that language, you will say it truly, because you can't say anything. And similarly, because you can't utter a Longlish sentence,
You also can't utter it truthfully, right?
That is also true. But importantly, you will be vacuously truthful in the sense that you will never utter a falsehood.
And the other way around, so.
Yeah! I mean, it's kind of funny. Sorry?
Why is this an objection?
So, importantly, it gives you a result that's ridiculous. It's supposed to be a reductio. Right? Because we should not have truthfulness and trust in Longlish, because we don't speak Longlish. We can't speak Longlish by definition.
Then we can trust it, right? Because we will never encounter a sentence that's false.
So that, in a sense, what Hawthorne is trying to do is to show that there needs to be something additional bolted onto the account of conventions. That's
I would just eat this Buddha. I
Yeah,
mean,
I think that's what Lewis does. Yeah.
This is like a variation of the problem of Fraser, right? Because it touches on the problem of an empty object and a negative existential. Because how can you utter a negative existential when there is no such thing to begin with, right?
In a way. Yeah.
Variation.
It's basically playing on this idea of this is a language that simply by design we cannot express.
Yeah.
So since you cannot express anything in it, you must be trustworthy on the cheap.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
I can't
You could also argue that it's not a language.
So here's the fun part. It's part of English.
Isn't the condition for a sentence that it's finite? Because if it's finite, it can be uttered.
That is
I mean, it's also
that is one
when you
thing
die,
you
you could
do.
just say, "Well, son, daughter of mine, please continue this
Yeah.
sentence until."
Just keep going. Pass it along. No, you don't have time to have children. You've got to keep talking about this sentence.
You could pause for a brief moment.
Yeah. Hey, I don't know about you. No, never mind. I was about to say something bad. So here's the trick, right? Here's the trick. Just as you say, we don't really trust Longlish speakers. At least that's what Lewis says. Right? Instead, when we hear someone speaking Longlish, we think, to quote Lewis in a different paper, right? They're trying to win a bet or set a record or feigning madness or really raving or doing it to annoy or filibustering or making an experiment to test the limits of what is humanly possible to say and to mean. So Lewis is going to say, okay, cool. Somebody could try something like this. And Hawthorne is right in that we don't trust them in that language. We think they're doing something else. Right? But that's fine. All we have to say is that in these cases, the kind of grammar that they're expressing isn't natural. It's used explicitly not for truthfulness and trustworthiness. It's going to be for something else.
So is the book a kind of Longlish? Because you could say that a book in its entirety asserts something, and it's very long.
It's very long, but it's utterable, right? Because
Isn't everything, because any finite sentence is utterable, right?
that's the trick, though. In this case, it won't necessarily be finite.
But then it's not part of the language, because that was one of the conditions earlier.
Good. But remember, when we introduce the finite, I'm going to go all the way back to the back because it's here. This is thinking about the formal conception of language. But there's no reason why the kind of conception of language that we've developed must be finite. That's what the objection is playing.
One could just add it and then sort of be done with Hawthorne's objection, right?
Yeah. Which is fine, but then of course,
Margin, because
well, so here's the weird thing. If we think about it as like, oh no, there's a finite limit, it would mean that as we're uttering English and we just keep adding and, we would hit a point at which we're not speaking English anymore.
No, we wouldn't, because we would also always be constructing a finite sentence.
Sure.
I mean,
If we think, if we keep the passing along, then we would just say it ends whenever the world ends or something like that.
yeah, but you don't have to define at the start of your language when it's going to end. You can just say, well, the end stops.
But it stops having meaning. Like my aunt is. At a certain moment, I think, okay, now I stop listening.
Yeah.
If you would
That's a
list,
slightly different interpretation of having meaning.
you would
But
list all the
It's
crap
the
in the
issue of
world
infinity minus
by
one.
name.
yeah,
And
that's
you still have
basically the
meaning
problem, right?
after the
It's
million.
cool. That's still an infinitely long number.
Yeah.
Okay, but again, the things to kind of get right is that what Lewis is wanting to try and do is to marry this social conception, the reasons for language or for our engagement, for bumping around the world, and to tie it to this language is about truth, And the reason that language is about truth isn't because it's something inherent to what language is. It's that we have a convention for using language for trust, where we have a trust in the language and a truthfulness in the language. That convention grounds the way that we use the language, the way that we engage with each other, and that ties the social and formal together. That's the hope. That's the hope. And what this does then is it suggests that we can think about not just language as a byproduct of semantics, so the meanings of words, and focus on this as a kind of top-down way of thinking about language, or just as a language's use, and we're getting around in the world with speech accents, grace, style, intention-based semantics. They're in the same ballpark. They're doing the same project from just different directions, which is nice. That's what we like to see. It's one of the few times where philosophy comes together instead of shattering into a bunch of little distinct sub-questions. Importantly, though, what it means is that we can kind of put aside these questions about the semantics and pragmatics issues and move on to some other fun stuff. So for us, the next few topics, what I want to try and do, the next block of things, is going to be about expressibility, understanding, and meaning. So the kind of broad questions I want you to keep in mind as we're moving forward are if there are limits, the expressibility of languages. So actually we were kind of talking about one, right? But there's also other ways. And here's one to kind of get a grip on it. Right? Is there something that we can express with a metaphor that we could not express literally? So if we say something metaphorically, are we saying something more than if we just expressed what that metaphor means directly? We see the idea, the worry? Here's another way to come at it, right? Is there something that we can convey with a picture that we could not convey with a long, detailed, complicated expression in language? The important thing here, yeah.
Could it be any other way other way than language? Because I'm immediately thinking of stuff like Buddhism. We say like we can't really convey our truth through language.
Good. So the idea here is that we're basically asking, is there stuff that we can get an understanding of, a grasp of, that could not be expressed with language? Or that could be expressed in certain ways of using language, but not in others? Again, the metaphor is a good example, right? Is there something that we can convey metaphorically that we literally cannot express? Meaning they're like directly expressed, described. Yeah.
Couldn't we get around this by putting everything in quotation marks? So we would say, what I want to convey is the feeling that one would get when listening to the following metaphor.
Maybe.
And also a picture, you could just list the pixels, right?
That's sort of that's what I'm asking, right? If we're thinking about these sorts of things, is there a limit to the expressibility in a literal way or in this kind of descriptive way that is going to be conveyed in some other format?
But is the question wrongly stated? It's not a matter of yes, no, but it's some ways are better than other ways, right? So a picture or a poem in some cases is a better way of expressing things, and a literal sentence is maybe for other.
Good. But I want to know, is there one where there's literally a gap? That's the fun thing. Happy to grant that there's going to be better or worse, but is there one where we can only convey it with a metaphor, that we couldn't convey it directly? That's actually what we're going to talk about. So the paper that we're going to look at is what's the kind of gain in speaking metaphorically instead of directly? Is it just utility? Is it just kind of, oh, this works better? Or is there actually some semantic content that's being conveyed that wouldn't be conveyed directly? So that's what we're going to talk about next week, actually.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't this boil down to the difference? Was it Frege, the difference between connotation and denotation?
That's part of it, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Again, there's going to be some different options here. Right? We could say yes, we could say no. Another thing that we'll talk about here is cases where truthfulness and trustworthiness in the language breaks down. So the thought here is to try and pull apart things like lying, being wrong, fiction, and just nonsense. Just to pick 4. We'll talk about a few others as well. So the rough and ready thought here is what happens when we hit limits of expressibility? What happens when we hit kind of cases where truth fails? And in different ways, to pull those apart. And once we talk about that, we'll then have a little follow-up lecture, because we have to, thinking about LLMs and relating that back to this things about truthfulness. This is where the understanding part comes in, because we have to. And finally, the last thing that we'll talk about for this block is what about rule following? How do we make sure that others are following the same convention? And it's very hard to get an articulation of this idea because we tend to think of conventions in this like driving on the left kind of thing. But what if it's that everyone's driving on the right unless it's raining, I don't know, frogs, in which case drive on the left. It would be a rule, a convention, that we would all be following right up until the frogs start falling. And then half the people start driving on the other side, and half the people don't. Again, it's a joke, but I hope you can see the type of worry here.
Yeah, you missed the on a Tuesday part.
Exactly. Right. So why is this a problem? Why is that? And it's not just to be silly. It might turn out that actually getting a grip on what counts as being truthful in a language is beyond our grip. It might be such that we have massive rule-following problems. That's what the last lecture for this block will be. So, specifically, we're going to have one on metaphor, and again, this sort of limits of expressibility stuff. Then one on what happens when truthfulness breaks down, then LLMs, and then sweet, sweet rule following. So next week, we'll talk about this metaphor stuff, right? Do we say more of the metaphor, or do we just say what we're usually saying? And there's a paper by Elizabeth Camp to read. I would very much suggest reading it. It's a really, really fun paper. Importantly, one last thing to say. Please do, if you haven't already, follow up the thing and vote on what topics to do for the last 2 weeks. I know some people have already, but it's still up in the air about what topics to do for lectures 10 and 11. I think I set the deadline for like the Friday of midterm week. But, you know, it's easier if you do it early, because it'll make my life much easier. I can write the lectures already.
Friday evening and midterm week when we'll all be focused and ready to think about something extra.
Absolutely. But of course, you know, the lectures aren't for a long time, so it's fine. But yeah.
You're allowed to do it earlier, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, you got to take it to the last one. Cool. Okay, yeah. Thank you guys.
Friday evening, beer.
Over a beer, look at the next. But yeah, excellent. So please, yeah, read the camp for next week. Thanks very much for coming. Have a lovely, lovely week. And we'll see you. It's time.
Yeah.